Hi, everybody. So over the next kind of length of a pint or so, I will talk to you, I guess, about AI and weaponry. You know, I think 2018 was, for those of us like me, hippie lawyers, the kind of year that a lot of us in the public woke up to some of the downsides of mass tech. But I'm not here to talk to you about Mark Zuckerberg or Cambridge Analytica. I'm kind of tired of it. No, the battle I'd like to talk to you about is, I think, kind of within the tech community itself, over maybe the sort of soul of tech, if you will. And in particular, I think it's a fight over the way that artificial intelligence is going to be used in armed conflict. I'd like to start with a particular battle in this war, if you will, talk about some of the wider questions I think that it raises, and then go through what I think it might mean for those of you who maybe work in tech, who might be kind of asking yourself some questions about what more you can do or where you can best kind of put your time and your talent. All right. I'm dating myself with this particular slide, the fighter select screen from Street Fighter. But anyhow, let's talk about Project Maven. What was it all about? Because I think to understand the battle, you first have to understand who the participants really were. On the one side of the Project Maven debate last year, you had Google engineers, academics, human rights lawyers, human rights groups, and students. And on the other, you had Google executives, people in the Pentagon who really, really wanted access to Google's artificial intelligence. And part of the fight between these two sides was essentially a debate about Project Maven itself, what it really was, what it was intended for, whether its intention was good or bad or what. So let's talk about it. What was Project Maven? Well, it was an arm of the Defense Project, the Defense Department's what they call Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, which is kind of soldier speak for saying that the Defense Department wanted to use AI to process images from drone feeds and analyze them, right? Now, they wanted Google, with its world-class image recognition, I think we can all agree, to help do this. Google bid for the contract, but they did so without kind of wider disclosure in the company and no kind of company-wide debate until the contract was signed and inked. This then famously led to a sort of open staff revolt. Some 3,000 employees of Google, about 4% of the company's workforce, signed an open letter that was then published in the New York Times that said Google shouldn't be in the business of war. What happened to don't be evil, right? And Google responded by scrambling, at least at first, to defend itself. Google executives and public relations people basically said, look, this isn't about firing the weapons, guys. Our AI is not actually going to shoot the gun. This is for non-offensive uses only. And I think it was Diane Green or a PR person said, look, the technology is used to flag images for human review and is intended to save lives and save people from having to do highly tedious work. By which you mean an analyst going and reviewing hours and hours and hours and hours of drone footage to try to distinguish, say, a sheep from a Jeep or what have you. This image kind of gives you an inkling of why I think that that's not right, why that that kind of hides what the major issue is. This is a still from the Collateral Murder video. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but that was some years ago when WikiLeaks published a video of 2 Reuters journalists being killed in Iraq because the helicopter attackers mistook the cameras that they are carrying for RPGs. So in other words, right, image analysis is and has for a very, very long time been at the very heart of targeting. So to say that it doesn't have anything to do with targeting or warfare or the lethal side of armed conflict just doesn't really wash. And that's why I'm here, right? The instant I heard those Google talking points, I thought to myself, this doesn't work. This is totally problematic. And it's not just about, when we talk about AI and warfare, the other thing I want to be clear about is, this isn't about the Terminator, right? This isn't about killer robots. What I want to talk to you about is humans and targeting and the way that human intelligence analysts relate to information that comes out of semi-automated processes. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the cases I investigated. It taught me a little bit about the way that this targeting works. This is Ahmed al-Sabuli, and this is Abdallah. I took these photos when I met these guys in Yemen in 2013. They are subsistence farmers, and they live in a village called Al-Sabul in Yemen's Al-Baida province. In September of 2012, An American drone hit a shuttle of shoppers going to market, killing 12 civilians and absolutely 0 militants. Abdullah on the right, when I met, told me of how he kind of rushed to the scene from the village to try and save the wounded from the wreckage. And Ahmed, I'm sorry to say, came a few minutes later. He was about 23 when I saw him there. And he could just make out the charred remains of his mother and his 10-year-old sister, who he just was able to spot from a clump of her hair. Like I said, 12 innocents died that day. There's no dispute about who they were. And it was just a shuttle of shoppers going to market. This is Faisal bin Ali Jabir. During the celebrations for the wedding of his eldest son, his brother-in-law, Salim, gave a sermon. His sermon denounced al-Qaeda, denounced militancy. He said it was spreading a cancer of violence across Yemeni society. And he said that everything that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was doing was totally contrary to Islam. A couple of days later, because in Yemen, the wedding ceremony goes on for like a week, a couple of young men, unknown to the villagers, come and ask to speak to Salim. Salim goes down with a local policeman, speaks to the men. An American drone kills them all. The anti-al-Qaeda imam, who should have been our ally, as well as the 2 young punks, if you will, and the town's only policeman. We investigated tons of strikes like this, very well documented cases of attacks on innocents. The Yemeni government, actually basically through the United States, ultimately paid these people because of the mistakes that it made. But we started to ask ourselves, how did it happen? Why do these kinds of mistakes keep getting made? And these guys both actually have a little bit to tell us about how the mistakes get made. You may or may not recognize Edward Snowden, pictured here with former head of the NSA and CIA, Michael Hayden, before they fell out. That both of them in their way have told us something about the way that targeting has worked for years in the drone program. In a panel in Washington many years ago, Michael Hayden made a pretty flippant remark. He said, look, we kill people based on metadata, right? So what does that mean? Well, the way that the family members died that I'm describing to you is very particular. The reason that they were chosen is particular, right? In the vast majority of drone attacks in Yemen and in Pakistan, innocents are not dying as a result of collateral damage as attack on a named terrorist suspect. It's not like we want to go and get this particular guy and we happen to hit these other innocents. That's not what happens. Instead, because the United States has very thin human intelligence networks on the ground in places like Yemen and Pakistan, they use an amalgamation of signals intelligence processed through various algorithms to tell them who is possibly suspicious, probably suspicious, and definitely suspicious, right up to and including a target. And the Obama administration called this a so-called signature strike. So in other words, we don't know who you are, but we think, based on our analysis of the way you're going about your daily life and your cell phone metadata, that you're up to no good and that you're some kind of a terrorist. When this was first disclosed by the New York Times about 7 years ago, the joke told by kind of CIA people who were a little bit critical of the program is they say, God, you know, the concern is the CIA sees 3 guys doing jumping jacks in the desert and thinks that it's a training camp. Now, that's a flippant way of saying, very obviously, that this intelligence is going to be imperfect and it can lead to mistakes. Now, you may be wondering, okay, well, but what's that got to do with AI? What's that got to do with machine learning? And that's where Snowden comes in. This is one of the various pieces of material that Edward Snowden leaked into the public domain. And this shows you that actually the United States government has been seeking to use machine learning to isolate targets for drone attack for many years. If you can see it, the date of this slide is actually from 2012. And it talks about, because I'm afraid we Americans have a bit of a tin ear for irony, it calls its program Skynet, in which it is going to seek to try and find targets for attack. I'm not a technician, so I will only talk about the way that it worked in the most high level. But basically, from people's cell phone metadata, as it describes here, we try to determine their so-called pattern of life, where they're going, who they know, and who they talk to. And that then is basically rinsed through a machine learning algorithm, and it's supposed to tell us who the greatest threats to the United States are. Now, the slide deck then goes on to say who their algorithm threw up as the #1 target of suspicion. in the then, as it was, machine learning algorithm. And it was this guy. This is Ahmed Zaidan. At the time of this slide deck, he was the Islamabad bureau chief for the television station Al Jazeera. His job was to go as a journalist and interview people, including militants. So yes, he absolutely will have possibly had somebody who was a militant in his phone, or he will have talked to a guy who talked to a guy to do his journalistic work. Maybe his travel plan going up to the tribal areas of Pakistan. Maybe that even looked to them like a militant back and forth to the capital. That's a bit odd. But on any view, the machine learning algorithm threw up as its number one person, somebody whom it would never have been lawful under the laws of armed conflict to target for an attack. And it also, I have to say, worries me, and it should worry all of you journalists, that it's got the, it suggests down there on his little baseball card that he's a member of Al-Qaeda. He was and is not. He is a journalist. All right. So back to Project Maven, right? That was 7 years ago. And the real talent, of course, with artificial intelligence and machine learning is not in the Defense Department. It's not even in the NSA. It's in the private sector. And the Defense Department strenuously hopes to use machine learning to deal with the fact that they are overwhelmed with information swept up by mass surveillance during the drone program in particular. So in 2008, just to give you a sense of the kind of scale of material that we're talking about, drone footage captured 10 years ago would have taken a single human 24 years to review, right? They estimate that all of their analyst time, something like 80% of it now, is absorbed just by image recognition. So somebody sits there with the video and types into the spreadsheet what he or she thinks that she sees. DoD wants to change that. They want to use image recognition to find targets. They want to free up their analysts. And, you know, these two fairly senior people from the U.S. military basically said, look, in an era of small wars where we are projecting force into areas where we don't want to have an actual presence, we've got to make up for it by intelligence. They said, quote, a global version of the panopticon is possible. That's how you know what they're aiming for, because they tell you. They've written about it. That's the aspiration. And in fact, after the Google revolt over Project Maven, one of the Defense Department heads, called Bob Work, rotated out the revolving door, as they sometimes do, to a private business called Spark Cognition. This is an intelligence firm supposedly selling artificial intelligence, and it describes itself in its pamphlets trying to sell its services to the U.S. government as, quote, human intelligence at machine scale. That's the idea, right? The idea is we can scale this up. We don't have to have humans helping us winnow it down and select targets all the time. That's a perfect summary of what they're trying to do. So, does it sound good? I mean, there's something about kind of freeing up analysts, I suppose. Is the global panopticon possible? Here's the problem, I think, that the United States has, right? The NSA learned to collect it all well before they were able to understand it all. Faster is faster. Absolutely, machine learning and artificial intelligence would permit the Defense Department to accelerate the process of target selection, but faster ain't always better. It's different. And I think that the existence of this technology is going to change the way that military officers and targeters relate to the information. I see 3 problems with semi-automated targeting at scale that we'll talk through. All right, the first one is automation dependency. Are any of you familiar with this guy, or for my fellow Texan Warren Vandenberg? No? Okay. Bear with me. This is a seminal video, which I recommend that you watch on YouTube, despite that it is about airline safety, right? It's a seminal video in airline safety. So old Warren, a Texan, American Airlines and the other airlines in the 1990s noticed that there was a spike in crashes after they introduced autopilots into their planes, and they rolled them out across their planes. It should have been safer. And the reason and the problem that they had was not with the autopilot itself. The problem was that the existence of the autopilot changed the way that highly trained human pilots, people who had logged hundreds and hundreds of hours actually physically flying airplanes themselves, reacted in a situation of crisis. So the way that old Warren will talk to you about it, if you go and watch it on YouTube, I didn't do a video, but anyway, He says, you know, they're meant to be doing like this, flying the plane the way they know how to do, the way we all taught them. Because, you know, you got some incoming, it's a dangerous situation, and they're not doing this. What are they doing? They're going like this. And he went on to describe how the existence of the computer software making recommendations caused the human pilots, the highly trained human pilots, to suspend their judgment and their situational awareness in situations of crisis, right? He called them children of the magenta line, by which he meant that they suddenly, even though they knew perfectly well how to fly planes, they couldn't make decisions about what to do when it mattered unless the computer's magenta line was right there in the center telling them where to point it, right? And I think that there is every reason to think that an automated process of, say, target selection that's telling human analysts who may be suspicious, who's probably suspicious, and who's definitely suspicious will raise similar problems of kind of automation dependency. I'll tell you a story about a kind of military contractor. I don't often go to kind of trade shows, but I went to one a couple of months ago, a talk given by a man from a company called Abaco Systems. I'll give you an example of how I think this could work. And he talked about how they were onboarding onto tanks. One of the AI image recognition kits they were onboarding onto tanks involves something called gesture analysis or gesture detection, which basically what it wants to do is tell the guy who's there in the tank, so in the threat environment itself, right, whether the person whose arms are up is trying to surrender or whether he's shaking his fist. Now, I don't know if anybody's done any kind of psychological studies on people in these environments, but I just thought to myself, now how could that go wrong? Like, is it really going to be the case that this poor man in the tank is ever going to ratchet it down because of what the computer is telling? Or is it always going to be the case that he's kind of ratcheting it up? And I don't get the sense that anybody's studying this issue about the kind of perverse effects that our relationship with the technology may have about the way that we conduct warfare before full autonomy. All right, that's problem number one. Problem number two is the, Plato didn't really say this. Problem number two is the kind of famous one to do with algorithmic bias, right? All of you know, you don't need me to tell you that data is not a kind of neutral commodity like oil or water or what have you, right? The quality of your decision making absolutely depends on the quality of the material that is coming into it. And we have seen in other uncertain human contexts, such as policing, that mass data rinsed through machine learning algorithms has a distressing tendency to replicate and accelerate all of our pre-existing human biases. So one of the best established blind spots where the police have been seeking to use algorithmic material to accelerate and inform their practice is predictive policing. You may have heard about this. So the way that it works is this, and these guys did a study on the way that it worked in Oakland, in the United States, right? Okay, let's take drug use as an example. Study after study after study shows that drug use is pretty consistent across populations in the United States, right? Like, so in other words, it's not as if a particular demographic tends to use drugs more than another demographic. Just not what the data shows. That is not the case for the way that policing of drug offenses happens, right? The policing of drug offenses has historically been done to communities who are poor and communities of color. Now let's go back to the predictive policing algorithm that has been used by Oakland PD and several other police departments in the United States. And now there's a report Liberty just put out this week, also by police departments here in the UK. The way that the algorithm trains, the data sets that the algorithm trains on to try to advise officers about where they should put police resource is arrest data. So in other words, what happens? Let's say that you've got a historically over-policed community, a community who are poor, a community of color. The algorithm takes that data, washes it through, and basically turns around and says to the Oakland PD, well, you went there before, you probably want to go there again. And so what everybody found, and study after study has shown this, is that it amplifies and accelerates the process of over-policing communities who are already over-policed. Problem number three. You can't know whether your target selection algorithm is doing well. You can't know if your AI is working if you don't count, if you don't check it after the fact. And the reality is that at least since the start of the war on terror, if not for longer, the US Defense Department has a terrible record of properly investigating and accounting for civilian deaths in wartime. This was a 2017 investigation by a couple of New York Times journalists that they looked at a small slice of war. They looked at the campaign against ISIS. But what they found when they went and they interviewed, they did absolutely comprehensive investigation, kind of multi-month investigation, that the casualty rate, the credible casualty rate that they found was up to 31 times higher than what the U.S. Defense Department said. This caused a fair number of ripples in the defense establishment in the United States. Just this week, they have put out a kind of big policy paper that basically says, well, gosh, maybe we do need a more robust practice to kind of count civilian casualties. But think about it for a minute. Go back and let's think about how machine learning is supposed to work, right? As I understand it as a lawyer, so forgive me. You've got a set of data, and then to go back and improve your data, to train your data, very often somebody needs to go and say, yes, you've got that right, you've got that right, you've got that wrong. No, not a cat, not a cat. Sofa, cat. But the problem with using it in these kinds of contexts is that nobody's going back and doing that. And there's a debate. So there's this paper, like I said, that came out this week where the Defense Department says, no, we're going to have a better process to count civilian casualties. But even now they say they can't agree on how they need to do it. Like some subset of these defense guys say, look, it's fine just to review the footage that we used to make the decision in the first place. We'll look at it, see if it seems like we got it right, and that's it. They're not going to put in more data. But I don't see how you're supposed to learn from your mistakes. How are you supposed to, if you don't put in any additional data from the outside? So, 3 problems with automated target selection. You can't know if you don't check. On the CIA side, by the way, John Brennan, then the head of Obama CIA, insisted for a good year or so that year the total civilian death toll from drone strikes was 0. He just said, we haven't killed any, which was obviously wrong. There were multiple independent reports by multiple human rights groups and journalistic agencies saying that was false. But that's just how they said it. Obama administration officials finally kind of admitted this. I know this is a long quote, so forgive me, but this is 2 people who were in the National Security Council in the White House who reacted to that New York Times story, basically saying, you know, actually, the use of this remote sensor, remote targeted selection is a problem. They say the promise of greater precision and certainty of fewer U.S. casualties, which leads to more frequent use of military force in more diverse theaters without a substantial U.S. ground presence, which entails diminished ability both to gather information about who is being targeted before a strike and assess what happened afterwards. With the human costs of wars substantially shifted to the other side, it has become easier to initiate, perpetuate, and forget them. Those are 2 people from Obama's White House National Security Council. So they recognize that this is a problem, but at the same time, as I say, the Pentagon is actively seeking to acquire machine learning technology to accelerate target selection. Anyhow, the Maven protesters, as you may know, won. They won the particular debate, and not kind of through a kind of technical side of resistance or anything through that, but through plain old organizing and communications techniques. So I mentioned the 3,000 staff writing the letter to the New York Times. Embarrassing emails from some of the Google senior people started to leak. A bunch of top professors and human rights organizations wrote and urged Google not to do it. And even recruits from American universities and others basically said, look, we're not even going to interview for jobs with you unless you scrap this contract. They scrapped the contract. Okay, so that's Maven. That's the first battle. Let's zoom out for a minute. We're not actually going to talk about Cambridge Analytica, don't worry. So, bear with me. So the aftermath of this. This has kicked open, Maven in particular, I think, has kicked open a major debate about Silicon Valley, about tech's wider relationship to the military and other government agencies. So now it's not just Google staff against Google brass and the Pentagon. It's not even just about drones anymore. It's other staff at, say, Amazon or Microsoft against some of the, I suppose, the main kind of security-minded people in the tech world. So Eric Schmidt, formerly of Google, Jeff Bezos, and good old Alex Karp of Palantir, all of whom basically say, look, guys, you've absolutely got to build this tech for the military or ICE. In fact, it's your patriotic to do so, duty to do so. That's what they all say. And they say because you got to do it because of these guys, right? You got to do it because Putin because China, because if you do not build and if you do not help the Defense Department build semi-automated targeting technology, they're going to pass us up. Not helping, they say, and they get other people to say this too, not to help is a national security threat. But here's the problem I have with this, right? I mean, you know, Putin has liked to beat his chest about artificial intelligence, and there's no denying that the Chinese are also developing military applications of AI. But we are not currently at war with either of these states. It's not necessarily a sign that we're going to be as such. And I don't think when people say this, when Jeff Bezos says it or when Alex Karp says it, I don't think that the hand waving is for a nefarious purpose, but I do think that it's obscuring the real uses and the problematic uses of AI that the United States is actually engaging in, right? The fields of battle are actually being used, not state to state. That's not what it's being used for. It's being used as a kind of global armed CCTV in places like Yemen or Pakistan. You know, the other thing I kind of notice and that bothers me about these guys is that they're highly supportive of national security work when it comes to bidding as contractors. But it feels to me like they're slightly less supportive of paying into the tax coffers of the nations whose national security policies they say that they support. National security is not cheap. When someone says the work that you're doing is going to save lives, I would like to suggest that you ask yourself whose lives are being saved and whose lives are being taken. Anybody know who that is? So this is Palmer Luckey, another of the characters in the kind of security-minded tech space. He has started another Lord of the Rings themed tech company called Anduril. For those of you who really remember your Tolkien, I think that this was the sword that was supposed to kind of keep the invading hordes of orcs out. Oh my God, someone will correct me, doubtless. But I think it's the sword. Anyhow, he made a load of money off of selling Oculus Rift, the kind of VR headset, to Facebook, right? Yeah, anyhow, and then he started up his tech startup. He knows that Donald Trump is not going to get his actual physical wall built, so he is marketing a smart wall, where he basically says, look, guys, you know, it's way, way, way cheaper, you know, only a few $100 million. You know, I can get you some poles with some cameras and facial recognition, that will help you distinguish whether that is a mountain lion or an armadillo. We do genuinely have them, or a migrant. I suppose the better to put people in the camps that ICE is running down on the Texas border near my old hometown. And you know, I do slightly wonder when I think about people like him and the federal contracts that they are now proposing to get. I just think, like, is that patriotism? Or is that just straight up white nationalism? He by the way, he maxed out his political donations to the white nationalist Steve King. Anyhow, so what about law enforcement, right? I mean, policing is more morally ambiguous context. You know, the police here often do very good work. We talked a little bit before about the bias problems with predictive policing, but there are other problematic techniques. So let's talk for a minute about facial recognition. Because I think with something like facial recognition, there's another question you ought to ask yourself, which is it worth making the system work better? Or do we actually need to ask a first question, which is, do we want this system used in this context at all? So Joy Buolamwini on the left is a researcher at MIT. She's Ghanaian, and she was trying to do research on facial recognition software and found that the computer didn't see her at all. Didn't see her at all unless she put on a white mask, right? And there's a really striking video of her kind of doing this, but the facial recognition just absolutely could not see her blackface. And there is a problem, a very well documented problem with most American facial recognition software, that basically it is nowhere near as good at recognizing the faces of people of color. The NYPD responded to this not by getting rid of facial recognition and saying, well, we've got some other kind of historical issues with racial justice in the policing, but by getting a different software that had a different kind of record of like racially balanced recognition of faces. They basically bought a technology from the Chinese. And apparently it turns out that the way that this works, by the way, the reason that they have a better record of seeing faces of color as against white faces and identifying them correctly, is just that the software kind of goes around the face and lightens it artificially. And then it apparently works. But anyway, so the NYPD, the New York Police Department, have acquired facial recognition technology, but where do you think that they used it first? So that's River Park Towers in the Bronx, which is one of New York City's most deprived housing projects. They had historically a huge problem with deep resentment of a major police presence there. And so the police thought, well, maybe, you know, if they don't like the officers there, maybe they won't like they won't mind the kind of presence of cameras armed with facial recognition. But, you know, there is an interesting question about whether that is actually better. It's no accident that the community that have been chosen for the testing of this policing are the poor and the people of color. The same company up in Shenzhen, by the way, just so you can kind of see the authoritarian endpoint of this. What they're doing in Shenzhen is the facial recognition software is being used to catch people jaywalking, right? So you get caught jaywalking by the facial recognition software, and you get a text on your phone with a fine and a message, I guess, to comply and be a better citizen next time, which I have to say, for me in London, would have cost me a lot of money at this point, I think. Anyway, so but there is a serious question where are we going to tinker with this and make it better at seeing black faces, or do we need to have a democratic discussion about whether we want to empower law enforcement with facial recognition, full stop? All right, so maybe you work for something that has no law enforcement application at all, and you're thinking, well, I'm cool, you know, nothing that I do could be of any possible use to the police or the military anyway, so I got no problems, right? There's no other issue. All right, so just a very short discussion about surveillance capitalism. The other profitable and popular uses, very often, of artificial intelligence are ones that seek to extract more value and information out of workers, out of laborers, and they're not all problematic, but some of them are a little bit difficult. Now, look, this is not new, right? This is not particular to AI. It's not special to AI. Bosses have been seeking to squeeze a little bit more productivity out of their workers since well before there was a computer, right? In fact, I was reading a book the other day and I saw something and I thought, well, this is just an early form of surveillance capitalism. I don't know if anybody recognizes these, but this is a shot of Californian farm workers from the first half of the 20th century. The Californian farms, right, changed the way that migrant workers on their farms had to farm for a very long time. Very different from all the other states in the 48 United States. They gave the workers something called el cortito. So if you and I are kind of out in our garden and we're weeding, you know, there's a long-handled hoe that we usually use, right? So we stand up here and we hoe and we try to get our weeds. They had the el cortito, which was called in Spanish by farm workers, el brazo de diablo, right? The devil's arm, because it was so painful to use, was 12 to 18 inches long. You think, so what? Well, you're bending down for 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day. It was absolutely debilitating injuries that it caused to people. And you're weeding. Now, why did they do this? Why did they insist that people used short hoes to do the weeding, to thin the beet seedlings or what have you? They said, oh, well, it makes the weeding more precise. But the workers knew better. They knew the reason that the growers wanted people to use el cortito, which is this, right? Let's say you've got a row of farmers all out there together in the field, and one person whose job it is to oversee them and make sure they're not slacking. If everybody's standing up with a long-handled hoe, it's not so easy to see who's taking a break. But if you're all like this, then you can see. So the idea that some part of capitalism is about surveillance and about wringing value out of workers is not a new idea, right? And Cesar Chavez, the kind of very famous labor activist for the United States who founded the United Farm Workers, getting rid of El Cortito was basically the first thing that they banded together to try to do after they got the right to collective bargaining. Thinking ahead, how that looks in the kind of modern economy, a lot of the kind of worrisome applications of artificial intelligence are about the assessment and tracking of workers. So I don't know, the picture on the left there is from a patent application that Amazon filed for a couple of haptic wristbands. So a wristband that a packer in the warehouse would use to track the movement of the workers' hands. Now, they haven't issued these to these guys yet, but the patents have now been granted. 2 patents for haptic wristbands on the workers' hands. Then, of course, there is hiring software. Amazon itself had to scrap its own semi-automated hiring software, basically because it was proven to its own satisfaction that it was systematically discriminating in favor of men and against women. And it's not just Amazon. I'm not just picking on Amazon. That still up on the upper right is actually a different company here in the United Kingdom, and others called HireVue, which, let's say you want to apply for a job here at Tesco, and you want to be a kind of bagger at Tesco. You're not going to be interviewed by a human anymore, right? You will sit down in front of a computer, and software like this will kind of scan your face and decide whether you are an appropriate person to be the bagger at Tesco, and it will give you a decision, sometimes in minutes, right? It'll just say, yeah, no, thank you for your application, you're done. I think that we ought to be asking ourselves some questions about the extent to which that sort of thing, that level of tracking of the worker, is the world that we want to be creating. Okay. I feel like I've painted a slightly dystopian picture here, so I want to close for just a couple of minutes by talking about some positive things, because it isn't all just kind of doom and gloom, and actually AI has a load of really positive possibilities that all of you probably know 10 times better than me. But I actually think that the story of 2018 is an exciting story. I think that the story of workers in the technological fields kind of finding their sea legs as a labor movement and realizing that they all along had so much more power to negotiate the terms and conditions of their work and what they worked on than they realized. I think it's an incredibly powerful and inspiring story. This isn't, the tech labor movement, if it is now a movement. It's not the first such movement, and it won't be the last, but I really sincerely believe that it may be one of the most important. Well, why? It's because the technology you guys are building is going to shortly underpin all aspects of our daily life. Very shortly, some form of machine learning or artificial intelligence will determine whether somebody gets a loan, whether somebody gets a mortgage, whether somebody gets bail, whether somebody gets paroled. And as we've seen, it may well determine matters of life or death in a military context. So the stakes could not be higher. So for people who are engaged in this coding to develop a sense of politics and the idea that they can band together to determine which way the tech is going to go, I think is really positive. And there are a lot of things, the other thing is there's a lot of other stuff you could do with your time. There are so many positive potential applications of artificial intelligence that would change the world for the better. I just came up with 3 that I thought of. One is very obviously the pattern recognition that AI is good at has proven incredibly good at spotting malignant tumors, right? An incredibly powerful and inspiring medical advance that I've seen some papers on just in the past year. Gerrymandering. Huge political problem in the United States, but it tends to be litigated very, very, very heavily. I mean, you might think, I don't need an artificial intelligence to tell me that's a gerrymander, but there are some, right, that are less obvious. And actually, there's a question about whether AI and machine learning could be used to prove gerrymandering, to prove the racial bias behind a given system, right? And therefore to kind of stop it and make the electoral process in the United States more fair. Or what about air quality in London? What about traffic patterns? Couldn't AI programmers do something to kind of reroute the traffic and make some of the choke points like Effer Road in Brixton, where I live, and the air quality there is slightly better, and therefore improving asthma and saving kids' lives in the process? There are so many positive applications. You don't have to go and participate in some of the more dubious or problematic ones. All right, so let's say that some of you are with me. And you're thinking to yourself, well, what can you do and how can you get there? I think the first thing you want to do is know about your work. It's no accident that Google sought to obscure what Maven was about or that the Chinese search engine Dragonfly was about. An informed workforce is an effective workforce, is a powerful workforce. The second one is community. I can understand why it is very difficult in any labor context for people to stand up alone and put their neck out, right? People's jobs are on the line. But when people came together, that's the whole point of collective bargaining. When thousands of people come together, they're much more able to have a say in not just the terms of their work, but, the people here walked out over Andy Rubin's 90 million pound payout for sexual harassment at Google, as you know. That took collective bargaining, and people took a risk, but there's much less risk than there's that many of them, right? I think there's something to be said if you get asked by the employer, well, why do we need to care about this stuff? The third point I would say is explain to the higher-ups that this is not just about being a do-gooder. In some ways, this is about risk avoidance. It's about avoiding potential harm to the company. How many Volkswagens is it going to take? It's not just about fraud anymore, right? But how many prosecutions or lawsuits do people have to go through for problematic data practices are corporations going to need before the people at the top realize that the way that they've been doing business for the past 10 to 15 years isn't going to wash anymore? And even if you can't do everything, or even if you feel like your work isn't necessarily implicating some of these social justice issues, there may be something else you can do. There's a tech activist I know called Cori who has started a really interesting sort of sustainable servers initiative. She basically says, well, servers are eating up more and more and more power. And indeed, in kind of 10 years, they're going to be a very, very significant chunk of the energy on the planet. So why don't we try to persuade major server banks to go renewable, right? That was her idea. It was what she was interested in. There may be some other thing that interests you that you can go and do. And the last thing, a plea as me, as a kind of human rights lawyer to all of you guys, is, you know, if there's an issue, a social issue that you're passionate about, nothing to do with anything that I've talked about, find the group who works on them and phone them up and say, you know, do you need a data head? I think it's a shame, really, and a shortcoming of civil society and NGOs and the human rights movement that it is largely still composed of, you know, lawyers like me. We actually need more people from the data space, right, who can help us analyze some of these problematic practices that I'm describing and explain to people what's wrong with them, explain why not only are they kind of vaguely unjust, but actually they're not statistically rigorous, for example. We need more diversity in the kind of civil society end and in the social justice end. And I think if you found that if you reached out to some of these groups, they'd be hugely interested in hearing from you. Right, so that's me. Thank you very much for your time. I see you've mostly all finished your pints, so you're going to have to go and get a refill, but appreciate it. Thank you all for being here tonight.